Imagine you live with your wife and younger brother in your own house. You trust them both, you love them both, but one day you discover evidence that shatters your life. Betrayal, manipulation, and humiliation. Everything turns you into a shadow of your former self. And then you decide to take revenge in a way they will never forget. How can you turn your weakness into your greatest weapon? And what price will you have to pay? Watch until the end. Hello, I will need your advice. Listen to this story until the end and tell me what you would have done in my place. I'll start from the very beginning. Back then, I still thought I had everything. A job, a home, and a woman I loved. My wife Liz was everything to me. We met at a friend's party 6 years ago, and I fell in love with her right away. She was confident, beautiful, with an easy smile that made life seem so simple and clear. I had always liked people like that. I could never be so sure of myself. Liz said I was kind, and that was the best thing about me. At the time, I thought kindness was a virtue. Over time, I learned that for some, it is simply a synonym for weakness. 2 years after our wedding, we bought a house in a small town. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a beautiful garden in the back and a basement where I would sometimes go to fix things or just be alone. Our life was quiet, sometimes even too quiet. Perhaps that should have been the first warning sign. Liz often complained that I was boring, that we never did anything, never went anywhere. She wanted more excitement, more adventure. And me? I just worked and thought that living a stable life was fine. After all, isn't that what marriage is supposed to be about? My brother Tom entered our lives unexpectedly. He was 3 years younger than me and was my complete opposite. At school, he was the one who could make people laugh with a single word, while I would stand in the corner and watch silently. Tom changed jobs constantly, always getting into some kind of trouble, but everyone loved him. He was one of those people who could always get away with anything. So, when he called and said he had nowhere to live, I, of course, couldn't turn him away. "It's your brother," said Liz when I hesitated and told her about his request. "Let him stay for a while. We'll see how it goes." She smiled in such a way that it made me feel easier. If only I had known that there was something more in her voice that day. That afternoon, I went to the train station to pick up Tom. He was exactly the same as always. Smiling, a little cocky, and full of confidence. He hugged me so tightly as if we hadn't seen each other in years, though only a few months had passed. "Jack, you've really aged," he joked, patting me on the back. "Is your wife sucking the life out of you, or what?" I nervously smiled. Tom always knew how to say things to sting, but I never took offense. I brought him home, helped him bring in his things. Liz greeted him warmly, too warmly as I realize now. She made tea, laughed at his jokes, and nodded at every word he said. "Your house is nice," said Tom as he looked around. "I didn't think you could afford something like this." "I've worked hard," I replied. "Well, you're a bore, Jack." He laughed, and Liz laughed along with him. I smiled too, but it felt forced. Something in that laughter already struck me as strange. The first few weeks went normally. Tom didn't bother me too much, even though he acted as if this house belonged to him. He would walk around in shorts through the kitchen, take my beer from the fridge, and watch TV late into the night. Liz seemed to come alive around him. She became happier, laughed more, joked more. I stood to the side, watching them as though I were a spectator of another life. "You should relax, Jack," Tom said one evening during dinner. "You're always so serious. Maybe Liz doesn't like that too much." "Huh?" I looked up and saw Liz smiling. It hurt. "Not everyone can be as carefree as you, Tom," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Exactly. Jack's a bore," added Liz jokingly. She said it with a smile, but something in her voice felt sharp to me. That evening, I sat alone in the basement for a long time. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Tom was joking with Liz upstairs, and I sat in the dark, listening to their laughter. It seemed to seep through the walls and press against my chest. Something was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. And then it happened. Something that changed my entire life. I had always been a person who avoided conflict. Even when something irritated me or when I felt that something was wrong, I preferred to stay silent and convince myself it was nothing. Noise suddenly filled my home. Tom was talking loudly on the phone, laughing loudly, joking loudly. Liz seemed to enjoy it. She looked at him in a way she hadn't looked at me in a long time. One evening, when I returned home from work, I found them in the kitchen. They were sitting at the table, drinking wine. Liz had red cheeks and a kind of laughter I hadn't heard in years. Tom was telling her something, and she couldn't take her eyes off him. "Oh, Jack, you're home already?" said Tom, noticing me. His voice was so casual, as if I were a guest in my own home. Where else would I be? I tried to joke, but my voice came out dull. "We just had a bit of wine," added Liz, shrugging. "You don't mind, do you?" "No, of course not. I'll go change," I said and left the room. I didn't even lift my eyes, but I felt that they exchanged glances. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for several minutes. My stomach twisted from some incomprehensible feeling. Was I jealous? Of my own brother? It was absurd. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but deep down, a worm of doubt gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. The next few weeks only got worse. Tom was fitting in more and more into our home, as if he had always lived there. Liz barely noticed me. She had stopped asking how things were at work and instead would spend hours listening to Tom. I would hear their conversations. I heard him talking about his adventures, about how he knew how to live. I heard her laughter. It seemed to me that she was captivated by him. And me? I was just the background, a rag. One evening, I tried to talk to her. I walked into the living room, where she was sitting with her phone in her hands. Tom was in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone about some plans he always seemed to have too many of. "Liz, we need to talk," I said as I sat beside her. "About what?" She didn't even lift her eyes from her phone. "About us. I've noticed that we hardly spend time together anymore. You've changed. I just want to understand what's happening." She looked at me as if I had just said something foolish. "Are you serious? Jack, you're the one who shut himself off. You don't do anything at all, you sit in your basement and stay silent. Should I sit next to you staring at the wall? You distanced yourself from me." But I tried to say something, but she interrupted. "Tom, by the way, is right. You were never interesting. I don't know why you think this problem isn't yours." Her words hit me harder than a punch. I fell silent and stared at the floor. Was she right? Had I really become boring? But I had tried. I had worked. I did everything to make our house feel whole, to give us a future. Wasn't that enough? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to Tom moving upstairs. He was humming to himself, and then his laughter came. A laughter that struck me as ominous. For the first time in my life, I felt anger, but I didn't know who it was directed at, Tom, Liz, or myself. The next day, I decided that I just needed to rest. Perhaps I was overthinking everything. I took a day off from work and decided to stay home. Liz went out to meet her friends, or at least that's what she said. Tom had also gone somewhere. For the first time in many days, the house was quiet. I made myself some coffee and sat in the kitchen. The silence was deafening. I thought, what if they're right? What if I really am just a burden? Boring, predictable, and weak? These thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. I took the bottle of whiskey I had long kept for a special occasion. I hadn't drunk for many years, but that day, a sip of alcohol was the only thing that helped silence the voices in my head. When I woke up, it was already dark outside. I heard Liz and Tom talking in the living room. Their voices were muffled, but I heard enough to understand they were talking about me. "He's completely given up," said Tom. "Did you see how pathetic he looks?" "Pathetic. You know what he's like," Liz replied. Her voice was indifferent, as if she weren't talking about her husband. "I don't even know how much longer I can put up with this." Felt like a blow to my head. I sat in the dark on the basement floor, staring at the wall. Their voices echoed in my head, blending into a hellish noise. I suddenly realized they no longer respected me. I was worthless to them. And you know what? I allowed them to think that. This was my turning point. But at the time, I didn't know what to do. I only knew that it couldn't go on like this any longer. I woke up in the morning with a headache. The bottle of whiskey I had so shamelessly drunk the previous night left behind a sense of emptiness and helplessness. All those thoughts that swirled in my head wouldn't let me rest. Liz and Tom were in the living room again. Their voices were barely audible, but it had become familiar. They were still laughing, joking. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to pull myself together. I honestly didn't know why it troubled me so much. Maybe I was just weak. All these years, I had kept everything under control, but now everything had snapped like a balloon on a rusty needle. I started drinking because I felt worthless. And the more I drank, the less I could understand what was happening around me. I went into the living room, and they fell silent as I appeared in the doorway. Liz turned her head, her eyes red. She put her phone into her bag and looked at me as though I were a stranger. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked, but her voice sounded emotionless. "Yeah, I just overdid it yesterday," I replied, trying not to show my inner emptiness. "Maybe you need to rest more, Jack," Liz said, though I wasn't sure if that was advice. She no longer laughed the way she used to. There was no warmth in her voice anymore, the warmth I had once come to expect. I didn't reply. I simply sat on the couch and tried to calm myself. Tom, realizing this was his chance, fumbled for the remote and turned on the TV. Liz returned to her phone. The feeling that I was unnecessary here became even stronger. It was as if I had been detached and discarded. So I sank back into my thoughts. They no longer tried to hide it. There was something more between them than just friendship. I could feel it not through words, but through their behavior. I had only recently begun to realize this. I still hoped that it was temporary, that it was just a misunderstanding. But deep in my heart, I already knew that it was over. "Jack, why are you so gloomy?" Liz asked again, but now her voice had the tone used for a bothersome household pet. I didn't reply. She raised her eyebrows, sighed, and went back to her phone. This irritated me even more. It seemed like the first time I truly realized how much time I had spent trying to please her. How often I had tried to become the man she wanted me to be. But in the end, she chose Tom. I couldn't tolerate this humiliation any longer. Every day became painful. I drank to forget. I drank to silence those bitter feelings that had started to take root inside me. And the more I drank, the more I could feel my anger grow when I looked at them together. I began to understand. I had allowed this to happen. I allowed Tom to enter my life, my relationships. And this is where my fall began. It wasn't just resentment. It was my weakness, and I understood it perfectly. My own indecision and fear of losing control had led to the point where I could feel nothing but anger and pain. I couldn't simply forget and move on. I couldn't simply forgive. I needed revenge. From that moment on, everything began to take a different path. I started to plan. I decided that the next time Liz was in reach, I would show her who truly had the power in this house. And as for Tom, I already knew how to handle him. He was no longer my brother. I could no longer consider him part of my family. Every day, I continued pouring alcohol into myself to dull the feelings inside. But instead, it only made me angrier. Whatever I did, my feeling of revenge grew stronger and stronger. And then came the moment when I decided I would no longer allow myself to be weak. I would no longer be the backdrop to their drama. It was time for me to become the one in control of the situation. I was ready for what lay ahead. And although I didn't know how much pain my revenge would bring, I was prepared for it, because I was no longer afraid. The next few days were filled with a certain silence. Liz and Tom continued their relationship, though they never spoke of it directly. I watched them, becoming imperceptible, like a shadow silently moving through the rooms. I didn't answer their questions, didn't interfere in their conversations, and that only irritated them further. It became my game to play the role of the unimportant one. And by their actions, they only confirmed that they didn't see me in their plans. The more they did this, the stronger I felt cold anger consuming me. I knew it was time to change something. Watching their laughter, I realized that Liz hadn't just forgotten about me. She had made her choice. She no longer looked at me as her husband. She looked at Tom the way she once looked at me. And this was more than just betrayal. This was contempt. So I decided it was time to play my card. I stopped drinking. I resolved that revenge would be cold, deliberate, and calculated. I no longer needed to use alcohol to escape from reality. I became colder and more observant, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first thing I did was become even more detached from Liz. Every day when I came home, I acted as if nothing was troubling me. I didn't ask where she had been, whom she had met, or what her plans were. I knew that every one of her actions, every gesture, was just a part of her game. She no longer considered me important. In turn, I decided to make her vulnerable. The first step was silence. I no longer did what I had always done before. I didn't try to approve of her actions or support her in matters that hadn't previously mattered to me. Instead, I spent time in the shadows. I remained in the background, observing her reactions. It seemed as though she had already grown accustomed to my indifference. She even began trying to speak to me, reaching out, but I replied coldly, as if I no longer knew her. And this frightened her more than I could have imagined. The second step was psychological. I began changing my attitude toward Tom. Instead of avoiding him, I started engaging more with him. I remained calm and composed, even when he tried to show that he was the dominant one in the house. I made him notice how I had stopped being broken and defeated. His reaction was intriguing. He began to show signs of nervousness. Tom wasn't used to me not displaying weakness, and while I never spoke about my plans, he could feel that something was off. But what impressed me the most was how Liz began to react. She seemed afraid of this new version of me. My silent, cold responses, my lack of emotion, and my indifference to her actions made her uneasy. She began to worry, and I could see it in her eyes. I could feel her confidence slipping. She no longer knew where I was, how I felt, or what I wanted. And that inspired me. I was beginning to control her. One evening, when Liz returned home, she looked confused, as if something had happened. She sat on the couch beside me, and I could feel her nerves tensing. She tried to engage me in conversation, but I remained cold and detached. I found it fascinating to watch her attempt to manipulate the situation. She was no longer the same person she used to be. She had lost her confidence. "Why are you like this?" she asked, her voice slightly breaking. "You weren't like this before." I turned to her, looking into her eyes. Silently, "You want to turn everything back, don't you? You want to feel as though I'm your husband again? But that's not the way it is anymore. Everything has changed." I didn't answer her, and that was the best thing I could do. Silence and coldness were my revenge. She began trembling. Her emotions no longer controlled the situation. She, like me, had become trapped in the snare we had created together. This was my game, and I was winning. But the more I played this game, the more I felt that there was another important step I needed to take. Revenge was not only cold, soulless indifference, but also knowing when to strike and when to remain a shadow that left no trace. And now the moment had come for me to decide, what exactly would I do next? I had become a true master at the game of silence. It seemed that the more I kept my distance, the more Liz tried to get closer, but every gesture of hers only drove her further. I could see her struggling to force herself to understand what was happening. Her glances, her attempts at conversation, her sometimes nervous jokes. All of it looked ridiculous and pathetic at the same time. She was no longer the woman I loved. She was just a person who thought she could control everything. But I had broken this game. With each passing day, I began to understand that my control over her was growing deeper. She began clinging to me more and more, even as I showed increasing indifference. At the same time, I started seeing the same nervousness in her eyes that I had once felt in myself. It was even fascinating to watch her become increasingly unsettled, trying to obtain what had once come so easily to her. She couldn't understand why I was changing. She couldn't understand why I wasn't returning to her, why I was no longer playing her game. I tightened the noose around her nerves more and more. Every time she tried to speak, I would throw her a few indifferent phrases that sent her into a dead end. I watched as she tried to find the right words, but I never answered as I had before. I didn't respond to her questions, didn't ask about her day, didn't try to be someone she cared about. I became entirely indifferent, and that scared her. But what impressed me the most was how Tom had changed. He no longer looked as confident as he used to. The same Tom who had come to me for advice, the one who had always been on my side, now found himself caught in the trap of his own betrayal. He, too, began noticing the changes in my behavior. At first, he tried to ignore it, but over time, his nervousness became evident. He couldn't understand why I was acting the way I was, why I wasn't paying attention to what was happening between him and Liz. And even though he tried to show that everything was fine, I could see how nervous he became just by my gaze. One evening, I was sitting in the room, watching him, and I heard him begin to speak to Liz about how maybe he needed to apologize to me. Though he tried to say it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was an illusion. He himself was beginning to understand that he was losing control. But what impressed me the most was that he was starting to depend on me more and more, and I only deepened his fear. And it wasn't because I had any particular grievances against him. I simply decided that I wouldn't give him any more chances. I would no longer allow him to manipulate me. After several weeks of remaining cold and detached, I decided that it was time to take the next step. Liz could no longer ignore what was happening. She could no longer hide her nervousness, and she began doing everything to draw my attention. She started concealing details about her life, not telling me where she had been when she wasn't home. But most importantly, her phone calls became more frequent when I wasn't home, and I already knew that it was time to make the final step in my revenge. One evening, when Liz went off on yet another errand with Tom, I left her a message on her phone. The text was short, but for her it was undoubtedly significant. I simply wrote, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Liz read that message several times, and I saw how her nerves began to crack again. She even called me that very evening, but I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off my phone and went to bed, feeling as though all of this anger was slowly transforming into control. It was at that moment that I realized I had done everything to reclaim my power. From that moment on, Liz was no longer the woman who could always manipulate me. She was no longer the center of my emotions. She had become merely a pawn in my game. And while I already knew that I had begun to destroy our relationship, I also knew that this was only the beginning of what was to come. Liz, it seemed, still hadn't fully grasped who she was dealing with. She continued to act as she had before, but every step she took now seemed completely transparent to me. She thought she could pull me back, but I was no longer the man she had once known. I had stopped being the one who could be manipulated, the one who reacted to every glance or gesture of hers. I had become entirely unpredictable. My indifference had become her greatest nightmare. Tom, on the other hand, had become even more nervous. I could see how his self-assurance was melting before my eyes. He was certainly trying to maintain control of the situation, but his efforts were becoming less and less effective. He tried to gain my attention, tried to imply that there were no enemies between us, but I never succumbed to these manipulations. I didn't respond to him or interfere with his attempts to maintain control. I knew that this was exactly what would work to his disadvantage, that I should leave him in the shadow of my words and glances. And so, at one point, Liz decided that it was time to act decisively. She called me in the middle of the night, her voice nervous, like that of someone under immense stress. She could no longer endure the silence. She tried to make me speak, asked why I had changed, why I no longer paid attention to her. But I remained just as cold and unpredictable as before, and she felt it. "Jack, why are you doing this to me?" Her voice sounded through the phone, but I said nothing in response. "You can't just leave me like this." Listening to her was almost laughable to me because I knew perfectly well that this was desperation. She was trying to maintain her position, but each word of hers sounded weaker and weaker. She was no longer confident. She knew that I wouldn't return to her, that everything had already changed, and that fear drove her to act irrationally. She began sending me messages, first emotional, then desperate, trying to reach me by any means necessary. She even sent a few texts apologizing, attempting to win back my attention, but I continued to remain deaf to all of it. At that moment, I felt power. I knew that I controlled her, that her emotions no longer mattered to me. She had lost everything she could. But when I saw a message from Tom, I realized that the situation was escalating to a new level. He was trying to appeal to me, attempting to seduce me with words. He wasn't apologizing or anything like that, but I could sense his nervousness. He was already beginning to understand that his position here wasn't as secure as he thought. He was starting to feel the ground shift under his feet. I even remembered that moment when we had spent time together, and I had been sure he would always be my friend. But now I was merely an observer, and everything looked very different. His attempts to prove himself to me were just as hollow as Liz's attempts. But I didn't respond to Tom. Instead of giving in, I began ignoring both him and Liz. I remained in my place, silently observing as they both struggled to find a way back to me. And that's when I realized that Liz was willing to do anything to regain my attention. She came to my home alone without warning. This was her last attempt. She stood in front of me, and I could see her nerves breaking apart. "Jack, please." Her voice cracked. She was ready to do anything. "I don't want to lose you." But I didn't move. She looked as if her soul was on the brink of shattering, and that was enough for me. I no longer saw the woman I had once loved in her. Now she was just a part of the game, a game I had been playing for months. I didn't answer her. I didn't move, only a dull, detached gaze. She couldn't take it anymore. Liz lowered her head, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. I knew that she was already at the breaking point. She had lost control, and I didn't care at all. I didn't care about her tears. I didn't care about her apologies or her attempts to win me back. She stood there for a few more minutes, silently observing me as I stood in front of her, completely indifferent. And in that moment, I realized that I had not only destroyed our relationship, I had destroyed her. She was no longer the strong woman she had once been. She was broken, powerless, and I knew that she would never be the same again. But I had no intention of giving in. I left her in that room until she chose to leave on her own. And at that moment, I felt how the control over this situation had completely returned to me. I was no longer the man who had been betrayed. Now I was the one who dictated the terms. When Liz left, closing the door behind her, I felt how extraordinarily difficult it became to breathe. But not because I regretted or felt sympathy for her. No, this was a moment of purification. She no longer had power over me. She couldn't make me feel guilty or weak. I had done what I needed to do. She had made her choices, and now I was free again. Free from her manipulations. Free from this toxic influence that had poisoned my life for so long. But despite my sense of victory, I couldn't say that all of this had no consequences. Tom, as I already felt, was also cornered. After witnessing how I lost interest in Liz, he became even more nervous. He constantly sought opportunities to talk to me, trying to find solace in old memories of our good times when we had still been friends. But I simply ignored him. And so, when I was alone in my apartment after Liz had left, I received a message from Tom. It was his final plea for help. And although I knew that he no longer deserved my support, I was curious about what he wanted. His text was filled with uncertainty. "Jack, I know you don't believe me now, but I don't know what to do. Liz made a huge mistake. I don't want to lose our friendship, but everything that's happening now, I can't control it. She made me do this. Forgive me, brother." I laughed as I read the message. "Forgive me, brother." Words from the man who had betrayed me behind my wife's back. What kind of people could be so hypocritical? How could one even attempt to justify their actions when they were so blatantly obvious? Instead of replying to him, I decided to take another step. I wanted him to realize for himself that it was all over for him. He was no longer a friend. He had become merely a part of this bitter cycle in which there was no place for forgiveness. I began to gradually alter my attitude toward everything connected to Tom and Liz. These were no longer ordinary relationships. I tried not to think about revenge, but it was impossible. I began to invent scenarios in my mind, ways to prove to them that I was no longer the man they could deceive. While they tried to justify their actions and reconnect me with their problems, I worked on a plan. I chose the strategy of silence and complete avoidance. I didn't answer their calls or messages. I left them in the dark. This drove them even more nervous. It was the most powerful blow I could deliver. And so, one night, when I least expected it, I received another message from Tom. He proposed meeting to talk, to express his feelings, and to apologize. I had the impression that he was no longer the self-assured man who once believed he controlled everything. He was broken, and I had no doubt that he understood that he had truly lost everything. Liz, our relationship, and even his own self-respect. When I met him, I could see how nervous he was. His gaze was no longer the same as before. He no longer looked like a man confident in his actions. His former self-assurance had turned into fear. He knew that I would no longer allow him to regain control of the situation. He sat in front of me, disoriented. "Jack, I can't do this anymore. I understand that I've hurt you, and I can no longer live in this lie. I just wanted you to know that I don't know how it happened, but I now see that everything was wrong." I smiled at him in the face, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a victor, a smile from someone who now dictated the terms. I didn't respond to his apology. I simply said, "You'd better leave here. You've already said everything you could." I felt him fall silent, his spirit broken. He could no longer justify his actions or reclaim even a fraction of what he had lost. And I didn't pity him. I left, leaving him there, and knew that I would never deal with him again. And although I had won, something inside me remained empty. I had received everything I wanted from them, but I understood that these victories didn't bring true peace. They only left bitterness, a bitterness that would never leave me. I was no longer the man who once sought to be better for others. I no longer sought approval or forgiveness. I had become a new Jack, and now all I wanted was absolute control without any compromises. After leaving Tom in that spot, my life changed completely. I was no longer the man who could be dragged into emotional manipulation or made to feel guilty. My indifference toward everything that had happened became my greatest weapon. I controlled the situation. I controlled my life. I no longer needed forgiveness or explanations. I had gotten what I wanted, and now all that remained was to end the game. Liz tried to take a few steps toward repairing our relationship. She began sending me letters where she acknowledged her mistakes and apologized again, but I didn't reply. I had already seen where this would lead. She was trying to restore my trust, but it was impossible. I felt nothing for her except emptiness. All those years I had tried to be what she wanted me to be now felt laughable. However, even despite my indifference, I still felt like I was giving a part of myself away. I had no way back, and the more I tried to sever her from my life, the more I found myself wanting to put a definitive end to our story. But how? How could I make this not just a lesson for her, but also my final note in this battle? The idea didn't come right away, but when I met Tom again, I understood what needed to be done. He hadn't changed. He was still hoping for my sympathy, for my approval. He hadn't let go of me, but I was already out of his reach. And at that moment, I saw the opportunity to do things the way I wanted. I began to plan my revenge carefully. I wasn't so naive as to simply leave them with their pitiful attempts to win me back. I had a more refined punishment in mind. Not physical, but psychological. I decided that I would play with them on my own terms, and then I understood. I wasn't just rejecting them. I wasn't just moving on, ignoring their attempts. I would act the way they had acted toward me, leaving them in uncertainty on the brink of despair without answers. It was far worse than any physical revenge. Every time they reached out to me, I would remain silent. I would ignore every move they made, and that would become their greatest nightmare. As I began to implement my plan, I didn't just leave them at a distance. I began to manipulate the situation the way they had once manipulated me. Liz tried to maintain conversations, asking how I was doing, but each time she tried to start a conversation, I would simply respond with one word or ignore her message entirely. and every time it brought her more pain. I could feel my satisfaction in this game growing. With each passing day, I could feel her attempts to become a significant part of my life weakening. Her pleas became less honest, her apologies less credible. Now I kept them on the edge. They could no longer pass through me without leaving a mark. Tom grew even more nervous. He couldn't accept that his position was hopeless. He couldn't understand why I wasn't responding to him. And the more he tried to reach out to me, the worse it became for him. I saw his attempts, but they were powerless. And this was only my initial victory. My real goal was still far ahead. I had not yet completed my revenge. In those moments when I wondered if I should have acted differently, I felt the bitter truth. I no longer had any emotions. I was not just a winner. I was a monster who had created his own reality and now ruled over everyone who had ever tried to manipulate me. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need their attention. I didn't want to return things to the way they once were. Everything I did was a part of my new identity, and I could no longer go back. Over the following weeks, I observed how everything I had set in motion was gradually coming under my control. Liz continued trying to act, to play the role of the submissive woman who regretted her actions, but it no longer mattered to me. All her messages, her constant attempts to approach me with pleas or even with hints that everything could still be fixed, I simply ignored them. And there wasn't a shred of pity within me, because I knew what I was doing was the final severing of everything that had ever connected us. Tom, in turn, began to search more aggressively for opportunities to contact me. He tried to add me on social media, wrote me letters where he promised that he would no longer be the way he had been. "I'll do everything to regain your trust," he wrote in one of his messages. But how could I trust him? How could I believe that this man, who had betrayed me, would now, after everything, become the person I had once hoped to see? All the darkness and lies they had created, I could no longer undo. I began to realize that even if they stopped trying to reach me, I could still get what I needed from them. They were already broken. They no longer had the strength to fight, and that gave me even greater control. Now my task was to ensure that they could never escape the consequences of their actions. Tom did not give up. He made one last attempt to meet with me, but this time I decided not just to ignore him. I responded to his request, but in a way that made every word another small drop of disappointment for him. He wanted to meet, he yearned to talk, as if everything between us could be restored. I, however, decided that this time I would play with him the way he had played with me. When we met, I could feel how he tried to appear confident, but his eyes betrayed his true concerns. I didn't allow myself to believe his words. His face no longer held that familiar, confident expression that had always defined him. I began to understand just how devastating his downfall had been, and that pleased me. We sat in a cafe where I had come alone, and he was late. As soon as he sat down, I looked at him and silently waited. The silence grew heavier and heavier for him. He began nervously twisting the cup in his hands, trying to find the right words. "Jack, I deeply regret what I've done. But it wasn't only about me. It all happened because of Liz. I couldn't resist her," he began, but I was no longer listening to him. My eyes were calm, devoid of the slightest emotion. I didn't respond, and that was worse for him than the harshest words. I understood that his actions weren't even significant. Everything he could say was merely an echo of mistakes that could no longer be fixed. "You just want me to forgive you? You want me to become your friend again?" I finally said. His face showed surprise at my words, and for a moment he even stopped breathing. "Yes, I know it may seem wrong, but I want to try. I want to fix everything, Jack." He tried to insist again, but I could no longer listen to this any longer. "Do you really think that I could forgive you for this? You betrayed me, Tom, and now you want me to bring you back into my life? Do you think I would remain the same old Jack who could forgive anything? No, everything has changed." At that moment, I felt his world collapsing. He hadn't expected such a reaction. His usual manipulations no longer worked. He couldn't influence me. I was ready to build my life without him, without Liz, without all of this pulling me back into what I had already left behind. I no longer felt anger. I no longer felt pain. Only emptiness, the emptiness they themselves had created. I looked at Tom as he fell silent, watching me with desperation, and said, "Sorry, but I can no longer be your friend. You stopped being the person I once knew a long time ago. You became a part of all this filth that no longer has any meaning to me." These words became his final blow. I didn't see him leave, but I knew it was the last time we would ever meet. From this moment on, I had completely closed the door to everything that had once been my life. And although I had achieved my goal, I didn't feel satisfaction. I realized that, in truth, nothing could ever return what had already been lost. I was left alone with the feeling that I had made the right choice. And now, without all these lying people, I was starting to rebuild my life. Free. Without them, Tom no longer tried to meet with me. I didn't hear a single word from him. And that was wonderful. But Liz didn't give up. She began to act more covertly, silently infiltrating my mind through small things that couldn't leave me indifferent. She knew that I wasn't responding to her requests, but she still tried to draw my attention in other ways. She began posting our old shared photos on social media, quoting our past conversations, trying to paint an ideal image of how happy we used to be together. I saw it, but it no longer had any effect on me. Sometimes I would just laugh out loud as I read her posts. She thought that by doing this she could bring my attention back, but in reality, it only confirmed how pathetic she was in trying to shield herself from the realization that everything was over. I understood that she wasn't interested in apologies or justifications. What mattered to her was only one thing: to return her place in my life, even though I had already decided that this place would no longer belong to anyone. I didn't allow myself to open up to her again. No matter how hard she tried to create the illusion that everything could be fixed, I was no longer the man who would ever give her a second chance. But one day, she did something that made me see all of this from another angle. Liz called, and it wasn't a message or a letter. She called and said something that no one could have expected. "Jack, I know that you no longer want to listen to me, but I just want you to hear this. You were right. I made a mistake. You didn't deserve this. You were always important to me, and I just wanted you to know that I understand everything that I've done." I fell silent. There was such a desperate attempt in her voice to reclaim something that I could no longer give back. I felt her emotions through the phone, but nothing had changed. I didn't respond. Now, I didn't even feel anger toward her anymore. I was simply empty, pieced together from shadows and feelings of uselessness. You know, I can't live like I used to anymore. I want you to know that I truly want to change. This isn't for you, it's for me. You gave me a lesson, Jack. I've realized what I've done. Now I could feel that she wasn't just saying this. She truly felt it. But so what? Words couldn't change what had already happened. They were empty. I turned off the phone. I didn't respond. What else could this woman, whom I once loved, say to me? I was no longer the man who would agonize over her remorse. I couldn't let her change my life again, even if she were willing to do so. She had long since stopped being a part of my world. Eventually, I began to feel that this was all just a game of illusion, that the only thing I could do was leave it all behind. I no longer expected anything from them. I no longer sought revenge. I sought peace. I began to spend time on myself. I studied new things, did physical exercises, and went on solitary walks. It was necessary for me to immerse myself in my own reality and forget about everything that had once held me captive. I was rebuilding myself, and although my actions might have seemed insignificant to others, they held tremendous meaning for me. But it was at that very moment, as I began to grow accustomed to this new life, that I saw her again. Liz had come to my house, and I sensed that she hadn't come just by chance. There were no tears in her eyes, but there was something more: understanding. Understanding that I was no longer the kind of person who could be manipulated. And she hadn't come to apologize. She had come to tell me one important thing. "I can't live in these lies anymore, Jack. I came so you would understand that you were right. I won't try anymore. You've defeated me." And in that moment I understood I had truly won. This wasn't just revenge. This was the restoration of my soul, my life, my dignity. I was no longer a part of the chaos they had created around me. I had stepped out of it and become a different person. Free. I looked at her and replied calmly, "I'm not looking for your apologies, Liz. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." And with those words, I closed the door behind her, leaving her on the threshold of my new life. When I closed the door behind her, it felt as though all the pain I had carried with me for so long simply disappeared. That moment was important to me not because I had finally let her go, but because I had finally come to understand that the most important thing in my life was me. I had emerged from this situation not only physically but psychologically as well. I was no longer her victim, no longer his friend, and most importantly, I was no longer a person who would allow others to manipulate my life. What struck me the most was how much I had changed. I was no longer that amorphous, spineless man who had let others impose their will upon me. I had found my inner strength, and now I understood that true revenge was not about taking control of someone or destroying them. True revenge lay in living life on your own terms, freely and without the shadow of those who had betrayed you. From that time on, I began to see the world in a new way. I started meeting new people, traveling, and discovering things that had always remained beyond my comfort zone. My life became richer, more exciting. Most importantly, I felt strong and independent, regardless of what had happened in the past. But despite all this, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in some kind of shadow. My battle with myself had ended, but had this journey truly come to a close for me? Would a part of that old Jack, the one who suffered, struggled, and saw betrayal as his weakness, still linger within me? I couldn't answer that question right away, and maybe it would stay with me for a long time. But now I was ready to live with it and keep moving forward. I sat at the table, turned on my computer, and began to write. I didn't know exactly how to end the story, but I understood that I needed to do so. Perhaps one of you reading this has experienced similar feelings, when the entire world seems treacherous, when your closest people suddenly become strangers. Perhaps you too have come to understand that true strength doesn't come from revenge, but from the ability to let go and move forward. So I leave you with one simple question. Can you give yourself the freedom to let go and not allow traitors to remain in your life? Are you ready, like me, to become the person who determines their own path and refuses to let others manipulate your destiny? I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments because each of us has our own story, and together we can support one another.